The Pennsylvania Game Commission's mission is to manage and protect wildlife and their habitats while promoting hunting and trapping for current and future generations. Since 1895, our agency has successfully recovered several species, some by way of reintroduction. Currently, 30 species are threatened or endangered in Pennsylvania. 9 mammals and 21 birds. Join us on our journey, fueled with passion and persistence, sometimes riddled with heartache. But often, joy is the fruit of our success as we learn from our natural world. Along the southern shore of Lake Erie lies one of Pennsylvania's most unusual landscapes. A narrow, curved peninsula of sand and dunes, and some of the last remaining natural coastline on Lake Erie's southern shore. It's a place shaped by wind, water, and ice, constantly changing, and a haven to hundreds of bird species. More than 100 Pennsylvania species of greatest conservation need are documented here. It's the most frequented park in the Commonwealth, with more than 4 million visitors per year. This incredible place, translated from French to mean almost an island, is called Presque Isle. Presque Isle is a dynamic habitat and is one of the few places in Pennsylvania where there is evidence of the recent geologic past and we can witness earth-shaping processes in action. Presque Isle is a recurved sand spit. Waves, currents, and wind move sand, creating many dunes, ponds, and marshes. The newest bars and ponds are growing at Gull Point. Its 6 distinct ecological zones are home to more threatened and endangered plant species than any other area of comparable size in the Commonwealth. But for more than half a century, one particular bird was missing. The Piping Plover, a small sand-colored shorebird that numbered in the hundreds of pairs across the Great Lakes, nearly disappeared by the mid-20th century. In the 1950s, Pennsylvania lost this shorebird as a nesting species.
The only place they've ever nested in Pennsylvania is at Presque Isle State Park. Back in 1875, that's when the first piping plovers were found in Pennsylvania, specifically Presque Isle. The first evidence of nesting occurred in 1900 when a female was shot by W.E. Clyde Todd, and it contained an egg. He went back in 1911 and found that they were nesting actively at Presque Isle.
But he spent most of the money on birds because he was more of a bird guy than anything. His first 25 years here, the bird collection grew to 100,000 specimens. The herb collection grew to 5,000 and the mammal collection to 3,000. And fish was quite a few more. His love was always in birds.
Up until the 1930s, maybe even the 40s, many as 15 pairs nested on Presque Isle. And then after that, we don't have a lot of information on exactly when the last nesting was, but we assume that it was sometime in the mid to late 1950s. So at that point, we really don't even know how many pairs were nesting out here.
There are three distinct breeding populations of piping plovers: Atlantic Coast, Northern Great Plains, and the smallest in number, the Great Lakes. The piping plover is a specialist. It depends on wide open beaches with little vegetation. Presque Isle is the only suitable nesting habitat in all of Pennsylvania. The piping plover is slightly smaller than the American robin, about the size of a sparrow. Its markings resemble its more familiar cousin, the killdeer. However, killdeer are much larger and darker in color than the piping plover. Semi-palvated plovers passing through Presque Isle on their way to the subarctic can be confused with our endangered shorebird. But a closer look at its markings reveals who is who.
Based on historic records, there were probably more than 60 sites where piping plovers nested. By the time the population was listed, they were only occupying about 6 of those sites, all within the state of Michigan. Presque Isle was the important site on the U.S. side of Lake Erie.
Historically, as many as 15 pairs nested in Pennsylvania each year, but by the late 1950s, they vanished. Shoreline development across the Great Lakes, along with increased recreation following World War II, set up the species for decline. The common tern, sedge wren, and bald eagle once nested here as well.
During the time tide was coming up here, there wasn't a lot of activity on the beaches. And then it increased over the years, and by the time 1950s came around, Presque Isle became popular as a bathing beach. There's been talk that some of the plover nests were almost stepped on. People were walking by, they just didn't see them. And from that point on, they stopped nesting.
The very foundation for the plover's existence was drastically altered. The plover's call faded from our beaches. Presque Isle's sandy shoreline and dune communities are part of a globally rare and vulnerable Great Lakes dune ecosystem. These environments exist only along the Great Lakes sandy shores, and in Pennsylvania are exceedingly rare. They are dynamic. Storms reshape them. Water levels rise and fall. Vegetation advances and retreats. Between 13,000 and 14,000 years ago, a small glacier moved southwestward into the valley, now occupied by Lake Erie. As the glacier retreated, it left behind a moraine, or shelf, which is the reason why Presque Isle exists. The shelf is about 30 feet below the water's surface and supports the moving sand spit. Waves and wind continually shape and reshape the shoreline by moving sand around the spit toward Gull Point. Plants trap the sand, creating small dunes. Between 1828 and 1923, waves broke through the neck and Presque Isle became an island. At one time, it remained so for 30 years. Due to the ever-shifting beaches, annual sand replenishment is needed to stabilize the shoreline. Old shorelines are represented as dunes throughout the park. The oldest dunes are forested, and younger dunes are open habitats that support dune grasses and herbaceous plants, even cactuses. Between dry sand dunes are ponds, home to many rare and endangered plants. The youngest dunes and ponds are at the farthest tip, Gull Point. Presque Isle supports over 340 bird species, including more than 60 bird species of greatest conservation need. Presque Isle lost the piping plover as a nesting species in 1956. By the late 20th century, the Great Lakes piping plover population fell from hundreds of pairs to just 17, a 90% collapse. In 1986, it was protected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as an endangered species.
Piping plovers have been annual in Pennsylvania back to the time Todd found the nest almost every year. Right into the 50s, and even after they stopped nesting, they were still being seen every 2 or 3 years into the 1980s. Between 1997 and 2005, there were no records, so that was probably the longest gap that we had where there weren't any plovers being seen, and that was in part due to the fact that the numbers had really plummeted by the mid to late 1980s.
There's a very high likelihood that the Great Lakes population could be extinct now, or just a handful of pairs. Having a species or a population listed leads to a mandate to both federal and state agencies to respond to the Endangered Species Act. So even if they're not interested in the species, it's not a high priority in the state, to a decision maker, there really is no choice.
As part of the Endangered Species Act listing process, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service must determine if designating critical habitat is necessary for species recovery. In 2001, the service designated 35 critical habitat units in the Great Lakes for piping plover. This designation includes all historical nesting sites, including 3.7 miles of shoreline at Presque Isle.
It just makes a lot more sense to work with where they were before and using science, try to figure out what needs to be done to make the habitat appealing like it once was. They like a firm, wide, sandy beach covered with cobble, not much in the way of vegetation. They like a distance from the tree line, probably to avoid predators. There are some older records that indicate maybe as many as 15 pairs were there, which means it was a very important site, and it was the important site in the U.S. side of Lake Erie.
Even without nesting birds, Presque Isle was recognized as essential to the species' recovery. The intersection of history and hope. Species recovery doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention, research, suitable habitat, and partnerships. Once a species reaches this point, once their numbers have dwindled this far, it takes a lot of effort on our part to see that they have a chance to return. 100 years ago, Gull Point's significance as essential habitat for migrating and nesting shorebirds was recognized. In 1927, it was designated as a bird sanctuary.
When Presque Isle was designated a state park in 1921, it forever protected from development this globally unique habitat that piping plovers and other shorebirds rely on for their survival.
Well, because of the way it sticks out into Lake Erie, it's very unique. It acts as a migrant trap for everything. Birds heading south in the fall, Presque Isle is the first piece of landfall that they find. And after flying across Lake Erie, they're exhausted, they're hungry. And in the spring, this is jump-off point when we're heading north of the breeding grounds. So we get great concentrations here for that reason. There's no other place on the south shore of Lake Erie that has the Plustrian sand plains. That's why we have so many species that are found regularly on Presque Isle aren't found anywhere else in Pennsylvania, just because the habitat's so special.
Piping plovers start returning to their nesting grounds in early April. If birds find habitat to their liking and stay to nest, adults could remain through mid-August. Every bird species has special courtship behaviors. The piping plover is no different. Upon arrival in nesting habitat, the male flies over a newly claimed territory, announcing his presence. He'll walk about his territory, chasing other plovers and purposefully tossing pebbles and shell fragments. He will also use his legs to scrape shallow depressions in the sand in many places. If he's lucky, one of these will become a nest. When a female is present, his displays intensify. She inspects his scrapes. While he tilts forward and fans his tail, the female moves under him, granting approval. The male will stand tall, puff out his chest, and strut behind the female with a high kick called goose stepping. When she's ready to lay eggs, she'll select the scrape they'll call home. Nests usually contain 4 eggs. Incubation spans 26 to 28 days. Parents take turns sitting on the nest for 1 to 2 hours at a time. While one parent keeps the eggs at an appropriate temperature, the other feeds while defending their territory. The very tip of the peninsula is closed to entry between April 1st and October 31st each year to safeguard nesting and migrating birds. But for decades, invasive plants such as Phragmites, narrow-leaf cattail, and purple loosestrife inundated the habitat, making it unsuitable for ground-nesting shorebirds. Restoring habitat requires careful planning and coordination across multiple organizations. State and federal agencies, conservation groups, and volunteers all play a role. For years, there were glimmers of hope piping plovers may return. Migrating birds would stop briefly, then move on. For over 170 years, people tried many different ways to control erosion at Presque Isle. Sand replenishment has been done since the 1950s. In an effort to stabilize the shoreline, break walls were constructed beginning in 1992.
It's the first time piping plover had been seen for 8 years. And at that point, they decided, we really need to do something about this. They needed somebody to monitor for piping plovers from that point on. We were getting annual sightings just about up till 1992, but there was no evidence of nesting until 92 when I found a male that was doing nest scraping and was being very territorial. Gull Point was still open to the public, and we had a public hearing, and I spoke at the public hearing, and Gene Stahl spoke at the public hearing, and that's when we decided to close off Gull Point.
This necessitated piping plover monitoring and pausing sand replenishment during breeding season if a plover appeared. This area is fragile and unique. Beyond Presque Isle, tremendous effort was underway to recover this endangered species throughout the Great Lakes, including a salvage rearing center for abandoned eggs. In 2005, 3 plovers visited Gull Point briefly. One even seemed to want to establish a territory, but they all moved on. As the Great Lakes plover populations began to grow, the species return to Presque Isle now seemed within reach. The Pennsylvania Game Commission contracted a recovery assessment to identify needed actions that could encourage the plover's return.
When setting out to bring back a species, especially one that's been absent for decades, we really had to take stock of all aspects from habitat quality and quantity and partner preparedness to be successful. The recovery assessment evaluated these essential ingredients and provided steps needed to give the birds the best chance and put us in the best position for their return.
The recovery assessment noted Gull Point had the best chance for plover nesting because of its wide beach, long distance from trees where predators live, and low human use. But it was overrun by invasive plants that would discourage plovers from coming back. Presque Isle State Park and the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy started the long process to restore Gull Point. Volunteers began monitoring for the plover's return. The common tern attempted to nest in 2012, but nests repeatedly failed. This was just 1 year following major habitat restoration inside the sanctuary. Shorebird use tripled, and migratory piping plovers stopped by more often.
We've recorded about 36 species that actually use that same kind of habitat. We have the greatest number of shorebirds during fallouts when they're forced down during storms. And unfortunately, Gull Point's a dangerous place to be during heavy thunderstorms because of the lightning and such. And that's oftentimes when we have these big massive shorebird fallouts. So we're only getting the small picture of how much Gull Point's being used.
Gull Point serves as nesting and feeding grounds for many other shorebirds, migratory waterfowl, and songbirds. At Presque Isle, this means maintaining open, sparsely vegetated beaches plovers and other shorebirds need. Invasive plants are continually removed. Monitoring the entire designated critical habitat unit and wherever beach nourishment occurs means we can protect plovers when they arrive. In 2017, 2 pairs of piping plovers arrived at Presque Isle and stayed.
That feeling is just indescribable. The entire team was ecstatic. We had worked for literally a decade to enhance the habitat, monitor for their return, and then they came back. Not only was it that Pennsylvania was recolonized in 2017, it was the first time since 1977 that we had piping plovers nesting on Lake Erie. The last known nesting was at Long Point, Ontario in that year. And then little did we know that the fledglings that we helped survive would go on to be the trailblazers to colonize these other sites.
Piping plovers have now reoccupied sites in all 5 of the Great Lakes, so that's a major success, I would say. But at this point, it's about half of the original 60 sites that are now being occupied. There are about another 30 that were birds nested historically, but a number of those are probably never going to be occupied because either they've been altered or there's too much human activity. Had no one reported that the birds were there, or had the state not cared and supported the effort this summer, they would not, most likely would not have made it for a lot of reasons.
After more than 60 silent years, piping plovers returned and nested in Pennsylvania. One pair successfully fledged 2 chicks in the wild, but the second nest was overcome by waves. Submerged eggs were rescued, and 2 additional chicks were raised and released at the University of Michigan Biological Station. The return wasn't the result of relocation or release. The birds came on their own. For biologists who had spent decades preparing for this moment, it was both intriguing and exactly what they had hoped for.
Species recovery when a population is so low is really hard, and it takes a really long time. It takes science-based decisions and an entire team to make it happen. When we were looking at piping plover recovery, we held on to hope. We had a measured and strategic approach, and we were ready for it.
And finally, in 2024, common terns successfully fledged chicks for the first time since the 1960s. The plover's return reminds us that recovery is possible when we listen, learn, and work together. Deliberate, science-driven conservation can reverse loss. When we tell the plover story, we are telling a story of ourselves, our capacity for patience, restoration, and renewal. But a returning species faces immediate challenges. Plovers, like many shorebirds, nest directly on the sand, making their eggs highly vulnerable to predators, to storms, and to humans. Protecting them requires intensive management. Biologists install predator exclosures, wire fencing that allows the birds to move freely while keeping predators out. Nests are monitored daily. If a nest is abandoned, either due to flooding or one of the adults disappears, eggs are rescued and transported to the University of Michigan Biological Station. Here, chicks hatch and are raised in captivity, monitored, banded, and acclimated to wild conditions. These actions are essential. Even minor disturbances can cause nest failure. In a population this small, every nest counts. When eggs hatch, the challenge continues. Plover chicks are precocial, able to walk and feed themselves within hours, but they are still incredibly vulnerable to weather and predators. For the first week of life, chicks cannot thermoregulate. They are susceptible to wind, heat, cold, and rain. To help chicks regulate their body temperature and to keep them dry, parents see to it. Both adults brood chicks and take turns protecting them from the elements and danger. For the next couple of months, adults will defend the nest from intruders, protect the young chicks from predators, and keep a watchful eye even on older chicks.
Bird banding is an important research tool used by trained biologists with proper state and federal permits to look at important scientific questions. In the late 80s, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protected Great Lakes piping plovers as endangered, little was known about how these birds lived. What were their habitat preferences? How did they use their habitat? Who survived the nesting season and how long do they live? Where do they go in the winter? Do they return to the same nesting site each year, and so on? Uniquely marking individual plovers, started by Dr. Francie Cuthbert at the University of Minnesota in the early 1990s, has provided really interesting insights into the lives of these remarkable birds and has enabled U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to evaluate their needs and adapt management actions accordingly. The number on this one, 2651 15435. Green dot. Okay. O. If nothing, then O. And then F is black. Now we'll just kind of put your feet on the ground. Ready?
And yet, some survive. They grow, they fledge, and eventually leave the Great Lakes, beginning a migration over 1,000 miles. Piping plovers typically live 5 to 6 years in the wild, but are known to live as long as 16.
Piping plovers are not a species that many people know even exists. Piping plovers are very worthy of recovery and protection for a number of reasons. First of all, they're one example of the tremendous diversity that we have. Different life forms on Earth. Piping plovers represent the coastal shoreline, whether that's on the Atlantic coast or in the Great Lakes region. And so this means that the sites where they nest, they winter, they migrate, are also protected or have high protection value. So the plover is essentially an umbrella species. Decisions have been made to protect these areas from unplanned development or some kind of change that will alter the coastal zone forever in many cases, and that extends to the other species that are there and co-occur in the coastal ecosystem.
The first decade hosted 20 plover pairs nesting at Presque Isle. Dozens of chicks fledged. Between 2017 and 2025, 33 chicks fledged from Gull Point, and an additional 14 from the captive rearing facility at the University of Michigan Biological Station. About a third of these fledglings survive and return to the Great Lakes the following year, to hopefully contribute to the next generation. A small but meaningful step toward recovery.
With their absence, there's so much we haven't learned. By having them come back, it gives us an opportunity to learn more about them. It also indicates the health of the environment.
The return of the piping plover is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a long process. Across the Great Lakes, conservationists are working toward a goal of 150 nesting pairs. 88 pairs were documented in 2025. Progress is steady but fragile, and it will depend on continued vigilance for decades. From scientists, from volunteers, and from you. There's a lot you can do to protect piping plovers and get involved in the conservation efforts near you. Respect the restricted area while visiting Gull Point. Stay on the marked trail. Leash your dog on the beach. Off-leash dogs are a threat to shorebirds, their eggs, and tiny young. Respect the no-wake zone around Presque Isle, and no mooring on the beach along Gull Point. Remove your trash and participate in a beach cleanup. And as you enjoy Presque Isle, remember to leave no trace. Don't feed wildlife. Plant native species in your yard. Once established, they require little maintenance or watering. And finally, support science-based wildlife management.
If we share the shoreline, we can have both recreation and species recovery, because this species' future is tied to places like Presque Isle.
On a windswept shoreline, the smallest life tells the biggest story. The Piping Plover's recovery exemplifies Pennsylvania's broader effort to restore threatened and endangered species through science, partnerships, and community action. When we are deliberate about saving a species, we can succeed. The return of the piping plover to Presque Isle after more than 60 years of absence stands as a living emblem of what science, persistence, and partnerships can achieve. Conserving wildlife is not a task for someone else, but a shared inheritance we protect together.